Prepare yourself for a journey through war and adventure. Follow Fitzroy Maclean as he takes you to the guerrilla battlefields of Yugoslavia. These are his words. Let's begin. At Alexandria, where we landed at dawn the next morning, everything was ready for us. An agreeable villa had been set aside for the partisans, and as we drove up to the gate, a guard of riflemen turned out and presented arms with a rattle and crash. An ambulance swept off the 2 wounded men to the hospital. I recognized the work of my old friends, Mark Chapman Walker and Hermione Ranfurly, the Commander-in-Chief's highly efficient military assistant and private secretary. An operation was needed to extract the fragments of the bomb from Milić's much-scarred body, and it would be some days before he would be able to do any work. Vlatko, too, clearly required time to recover from the stress and strain of the last few days and the sudden plunge back into civilization after the long months and years of guerrilla life. Leaving them to settle into their new surroundings, I went up to Cairo to report, taking Bill Deacon with me. Cairo was buzzing. Despite the most elaborate security arrangements, everyone knew that Mr. Churchill and the President of the United States were there. They had arrived a few days before from Tehran, where, according to the latest press releases, there had been a conference with Marshal Stalin. Now, it appeared, a further conference was in progress at which Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek would also be present. The whole place was swarming with high officials, admirals, generals, and air marshals. All of Whitehall seemed to be there. If we did not get our particular problem cleared up now, we never would. The first thing was to see the Prime Minister. We found him installed in a villa out by the pyramids. He was in bed when we arrived, smoking a cigar and wearing an embroidered dressing gown. He started by telling us some anecdotes about the Tehran conference and his meeting with Stalin. This, it appeared, had been a success. Then he asked me whether I wore a kilt when I was dropped out of an aeroplane, and from this promising point of departure, we slid into a general discussion of the situation in Yugoslavia. He had read my report, and in its light, and in the light of all other available information, had talked over the Yugoslav problem with Stalin and Roosevelt at Tehran. As a result of these talks, it had been decided to give all-out support to the partisans. There remained the question of the Chetniks of General Mihailovic, to whom up to then we had been giving rather more help than to the partisans, and to whom a British military mission was still accredited. It appeared that evidence from several sources, and notably the reports of British officers attached to Chetnik formations, confirmed the impression which I myself had gained, namely, that General Mihailovic had for some time past been anything but wholehearted in his resistance to the Germans, that discipline amongst his forces was poor, and that many of his commanders were collaborating more or less openly with the enemy. In short, his contribution to the Allied cause was by now little or nothing, with such operations as were performed largely the work of the small number of British officers attached to the Chetnik forces. In the circumstances, it was proposed to give Mihailovic a last chance. He was to be requested, through the British mission attached to his headquarters, to blow up a certain railway bridge of considerable strategic importance on the Belgrade-Salonika railway. If he failed to carry out this operation by a certain date, the mission would be withdrawn and supplies to the Chetniks would cease. This seemed fair enough. I now emphasized to Mr. Churchill the other points which I had already made in my report, namely, that in my view the partisans, whether we helped them or not, would be the decisive political factor in Yugoslavia after the war, and, secondly, that Tito and the other leaders of the movement were openly and avowedly communist, and that the system which they would establish would inevitably be on Soviet lines and, in all probability, strongly oriented towards the Soviet Union. The Prime Minister's reply resolved my doubts. "Do you intend," he asked, "to make Yugoslavia your home after the war?" "No, sir," I replied. "Neither do I," he said. "And, that being so, the less you and I worry about the form of government they set up, the better. That is for them to decide. What interests us is, which of them is doing the most harm to the Germans?" Thinking our conversation over afterward, I felt convinced that this was the right decision. In 1943, the turning point of the war had been reached, but this was by no means as clear then as it is now. In Italy, our armies were still south of Rome and making but slow progress. The Normandy landings were only a remote project. On the Eastern Front, the Germans still stood at the gates of Leningrad and Moscow. The American war effort was as yet only beginning to get into its stride. In the Far East, the Japanese were still undefeated. If we were to make certain of achieving ultimate victory, and of achieving it without unnecessarily prolonging the bloodshed and destruction, we could not afford to neglect any potential ally. In 1941, when we stood alone, We had thankfully accepted Russia as an ally without examining too closely her political system or the circumstances which had brought her into the war on our side. Ever since, we had done everything in our power to bolster up her war effort. Having once taken this major decision of principle, to refuse help to the Yugoslav partisans on ideological grounds would have been scarcely logical. Nor would it have been an easy decision to defend on any grounds, for we should have been abandoning to their fate, on the basis of a long-term political calculation, brave men who, whatever their motives, were fighting well and effectively on our side in a desperate struggle against a common enemy. Besides, taking a long view, it seemed just conceivable that, in the end, nationalism might triumph over communism. Stranger things had happened in the Balkans. But there was one aspect of the situation which was still disturbing Mr. Churchill. In 1941, after Prince Paul had come to terms with the Germans, King Peter of Yugoslavia, still in his teens, had headed the revolt which threw out the regent and his government and brought the country into the war on the side of Great Britain, at that time fighting alone against the Axis. Then, when the German invasion and occupation had forced him to flee, he had taken refuge in Great Britain, where he had formed a government in exile. This government had from the outset backed Milosevic and shown a corresponding hostility towards Tito, whom they regarded as a dangerous revolutionary upstart. The British government now found themselves in an awkward situation. Morally, they were under a definite obligation to King Peter, who had thrown in his lot with Great Britain in her hour of need, and politically, they were committed to his government with whom they were in diplomatic relations. But they were now about to commit themselves militarily to the partisans, whom both king and government regarded with repugnance and distrust, sentiments which the partisans were inclined to reciprocate. King Peter had recently moved to Cairo, theoretically in order to be nearer to Yugoslavia, and it was felt that it might be useful if, while I was in Cairo, I saw the king and gave him a first-hand account of the situation in Yugoslavia. It was accordingly arranged that we should dine together with Ralph Stevenson, who at that time held the post of British ambassador to the Yugoslav government in exile. King Peter, I found, was a friendly young man, happiest when he was talking about motor cars and aeroplanes, but also, I feel certain, genuinely interested in the fate of his unfortunate country and people. He asked me what the partisans and the other Yugoslavs I had met thought of him. I told him that they resented some of the proclamations made in his name over the wireless, condemning their leaders to death as traitors. Apart from that, they did not take much interest in him. Their day-to-day life gave them too much to think about. Next, he asked me what prospect I thought he had of recovering his throne after the war. I replied, none, unless he could somehow go back and take part in the war of liberation, side by side with his people, as his father had done in the last war. Otherwise, the gap between him and them would be too wide. They had undergone too much and were too obsessed with their experiences ever to be ruled over by a king who, through no fault of his own, had spent most of the war years in London or Cairo. King Peter listened attentively. I wish, he replied as he said goodbye, that it only depended on me. The decision to give all the help in our power to the partisans provided a new and firm basis for the military discussions which now opened at Alexandria. These covered a wide range of subjects. Air Marshal Sholto Douglas, the Air Officer Commander-in-Chief, promised to train and equip a Yugoslav fighter squadron, and General Wilson promised a tank regiment, while the Naval Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Willis, undertook to find some light naval craft to form the nucleus of a partisan navy, in addition to the British naval forces, which, it was agreed, should operate off the Dalmatian coast. But these were long-term projects, affecting a much later phase of the war, for clearly, under existing conditions, there could be no question of sending either tanks or aircraft to operate from bases in Yugoslavia, and it would take a considerable time to find men suitable for the purpose, get them out of Yugoslavia, and train them in Italy or North Africa. In reality, the most important subjects discussed at Alexandria were the burning questions of air supply and air support, both of which directly affected the immediate conduct of operations in what was coming to be regarded as the Yugoslav theater of war. Here, the decisions taken were of immediate and far-reaching importance. In the first place, it was decided to increase substantially the allotment of supplies to the partisans, and, equally important, the number of aircraft set aside for supply dropping. These would operate from airfields in southern Italy, and a supply base would be established at Bari. It was also confirmed that the scope of my mission should be extended, and that a number of British officers serving under my command should be dropped to the principal partisan formations throughout Yugoslavia. Their main task would be to organize supplies, but they would also include a certain number of technical advisors and instructors. With the expansion of my mission, I needed more officers, and, before leaving Egypt, I set about recruiting some. The first place to draw, I decided, was Peter Sterling's flat in Cairo. Now that David Sterling was a prisoner and Bill in Algiers with the 2nd Special Air Service Regiment, it no longer had quite the same air of an operations room or an armed camp as previously, but there were nevertheless generally still quite a number of enterprising characters to be found there. Moreover, now that Cairo had become more or less of a backwater, you could be certain that any likely recruits would jump at the chance of a fairly active job. Peter's food and drink, I found, was as good and plentiful as ever, and was still served by Peter's Arab servant, Mohammed or Mo, to the same accompaniment of grumbling and backchat. The party was a cheerful one, though not, it appeared, quite as animated as another party which had taken place there some weeks earlier, after which the host had woken the next morning to find an entirely unexplained donkey tethered to the foot of his bed, quietly nibbling a basketful of Joaillier de Dijon roses. A few days before, the Foreign Secretary had announced for the first time in a speech in the House of Commons that I had been dropped by parachute into Yugoslavia, thereby causing, I believe, a mild sensation, for I had never attended the House, and none of my fellow members had the faintest idea who the honourable member for Lancaster was. Now someone produced a copy of the Daily Express, which had made headline news of the announcement. Down the middle of the front page stretched an immensely elongated photograph of myself in uniform, with, beneath it, the caption, "Kilted Pimpernel," and beneath that, a good deal more colourful material in the same vein. This took a lot of living down. In the end, it was Mo who came to my rescue. "Brigadier, very fine fellow," he remarked soothingly. "One day he catch it scissors," a prophetic reference to the crossed swords of a major general, which was only to be temporarily fulfilled at a very much later date. After that, we mixed a delicious drink in the bathtub, and a good time, as the saying goes, was had by all. This made a pleasant change from the round of staff talks and conferences. Nor did I leave Cairo empty-handed. Before flying back to Italy, I made several additions to my officer's strength. One was Andrew Maxwell, of the Scots Guards, a cousin of the Sterlings, who, while on leave from his battalion, had accompanied the Special Air Service on their last expedition to Benghazi. Another was John Clark, a former adjutant of the 2nd Scots Guards and a regular soldier, who, having just emerged from a course at the Staff College, was desperately afraid of being put into a sedentary staff job. Then there was Geoffrey Cupp, a gunnery expert, who I intended should instruct the partisans in the use of a battery of 75mm pack howitzers, which we had promised them, complete with mules. Finally, there was Randolph Churchill. After taking part in the Salerno landings with Bob Laycock's commandos, he had accompanied his father to Tehran and Cairo and was now at a loose end. Randolph, it occurred to me, would make a useful addition to my mission. There was some work, for instance, of a sedentary description at a large headquarters, full of touchy or sensitive staff officers, for which I would not have chosen him. But for my present purposes, he seemed just the man. On operations, I knew him to be thoroughly dependable, possessing both endurance and determination. He was also gifted with an acute intelligence and a very considerable background in general politics, neither of which would come amiss in Yugoslavia. I felt, too, rightly, as it turned out, that he would get on well with the Yugoslavs, for his enthusiastic and at times explosive approach to life was not unlike their own. Lastly, I knew him to be a stimulating companion, an important consideration in the circumstances under which we lived. On my return to Italy, I found the news from Yugoslavia increasingly disquieting. The enemy's drive to the coast had developed into a general offensive, and Livno and Glamoc had fallen. In the islands, the situation was more serious than ever. Island after island had been recaptured by the enemy, and it seemed likely to be only a matter of weeks, if not days, before we lost our last foothold there. This brought my mind back from the general problem to the particular one, and to my old project of establishing a firm base on Vis or one of the other islands before it was too late. I decided that before rejoining Tito in Bosnia, I would go across and have a look for myself. We made the journey this time in a motor torpedo boat, roaring across the Adriatic in what must have been record time. As we reached the open sea, we met 2 Hunt-class destroyers, returning from a patrol in enemy waters. They were a fine sight, traveling at full speed, with the sea boiling and seething in their wake. Evidently, the Navy was already beginning to devote more attention to these parts. Our first port of call was Villa Luca on the island of Korčula, where we landed the arms and ammunition we had brought with us. The Pelješac Peninsula had been evacuated under heavy pressure from the enemy, and the whole island was now filled with partisans from the mainland, preparing as best they could to beat off the German landing in force, which was bound to follow soon. From Villa Luca, we made our way across the island to the town of Korčula, where the brunt of the attack seemed likely to fall. Here the bulk of the defending forces was concentrated, and little remained of the peaceful scene which I remembered from the autumn. Gun positions and strongpoints were established everywhere, and many of the buildings had already been damaged by enemy shellfire. From the garden of the little house in which I had lived during my previous visit, we could see the Germans moving about on Peljušac across the water. At the same time, they saw us, and a salvo of shells came whistling across the straits and landed in the rocks behind the house. The partisans, with the guns they had taken from the Italians, replied, and we ate our lunch to the accompaniment of an artillery duel. But it was only too clear that the partisans had little prospect of holding out. In the first place, the defense of fixed positions was manifestly the wrong role for guerrilla forces, and, in any case, the enemy forces opposing them possessed a crushing superiority both in numbers and armament. And indeed, a few days later, Korčula fell to the Germans. This applied with equal force to the other islands. Once one had fallen, the others were likely to follow. Nor would it be sound strategy for the partisans to devote more than limited resources to opposing the German landings. Indeed, in the long run, it might actually prove to our advantage to allow the Germans to establish garrisons on the islands, for these, from the German point of view, would be useless and costly to maintain, while to us they would offer easy targets for raids, sabotage, and harassing operations of all kinds. But to put this policy into effect, we must have a base, and if such a base was to be held, the necessary measures would need to be taken quickly, and outside help would be required. The more we talked the problem over and the more we studied the map, the clearer it became that our base, if there were to be one, would have to be Vis. I decided to go there at once and study the problem on the spot, taking Velebit with me. Vivian Street, who had remained on the islands while I had gone to Egypt, was there to meet us. It was after midnight when we arrived, and, turning off the road at the first gate we came to, I spread out my sleeping bag on a flat stone and went to sleep. When I woke, the sun was up, and, looking around me, I found that I had been sleeping in a graveyard. The priest's house was nearby, and there we washed and ate our rations. After breakfast, we set out to make a thorough reconnaissance of the island. Vis, like its neighbors, is a craggy, rock-strewn island, with every square yard of arable land under cultivation. Two parallel ranges of hills run the whole length of the island from east to west. Between them lies a long fertile valley, planted at that time with vines and olives. Most of the population is concentrated in the two small towns of Vis and Komiža, of which the first lies at the eastern end and the latter at the western end of the island. Both cluster around the two principal harbors of the island and are little more than fishing villages, though deriving a certain dignity from the crumbling forts and mansions bequeathed to them by the Venetians and those who followed them. We stopped to eat our midday meal at a farmhouse, perched on a hill overlooking the smiling vineyards and olive groves of the Central Valley. The Royal Air Force officer whom we had brought with us was in a state of some excitement. He had examined the valley from every angle and had come to the conclusion that it could be converted into a first-class airfield. To the uninitiated, this was not so immediately obvious, and one's mind dwelt involuntarily on the destruction that this transformation would involve. But he was the expert, and the conclusion which he had reached was clearly of very considerable importance, as Velebit and the other partisans present were the first to recognize. If Allied fighters could be based here or could even land here to refuel, their range for operations over Yugoslavia would immediately be increased by the whole width of the Adriatic. This discovery constituted another very cogent argument for establishing a firm base on Vis. The Royal Navy, whose light craft were already operating most successfully against enemy shipping from temporary bases in the islands, though without any real security of tenure, were, we knew, strongly in favor of the idea and would clearly welcome the prospect of occasional fighter support. But before we could go any further, a garrison had to be found. It was calculated that a force of at least 2 brigades would be required to hold the island. The partisans offered to provide 1 brigade, if we would furnish the other. Clearly, it was most desirable that we should find one. I left the island wondering where it was to come from. I had made tentative soundings as to the possibility of British troops taking part in the defense of the islands before leaving Cairo, but without success. Our fighting troops in the Middle East had long since been reduced to a bare minimum, and every man who could be spared was sent to Italy. Our troops in Italy came under a separate command, 15th Army Group, with whom I had as yet had no direct contact. From what I knew of the military situation in Italy, however, I did not imagine that General Alexander, then commanding 15th Army Group, would have even a brigade to spare for a sideshow like ours. A first approach to 15th Army Group met with a reply which I had expected, namely, that they wished they could help, but were themselves short of men. Then, by chance, I stumbled on what seemed a possible solution. Randolph, essentially gregarious by nature, happened to meet in Bari a friend and also a namesake of his, Jack Churchill, then commanding No. 2 Commando, whom he had known at Salerno. Jack Churchill and his brother Tom, who was commanding the Commando Brigade, of which No. 2 Commando formed a part, then asked Randolph and myself to come to a party which they were giving on New Year's Eve in their mess at Molfetta, up the coast from Bari. Once there, I soon realized that the Churchill brothers were an outstanding pair. Both were regular soldiers. Jack, the elder, had the dashing and formidable appearance which one generally associates with a Barbary corsair or a condottiere of the Renaissance, an impression which was enhanced by a highly polished and extremely deadly-looking dagger which he was wearing in his Sam Brown belt, while the metal ribbons on his tunic showed that it was not only their dashing appearance that he shared, but their soldierly qualities as well. Tom, the younger brother who commanded the brigade, was also an experienced fighting soldier. Half an hour's conversation with him showed me that he possessed a penetrating intelligence. Inevitably, we talked shop. I asked him what plans he had for his commandos. He asked me whether I had ever thought of the possibility of harassing operations on the Dalmatian coast and islands. I replied that for some weeks past I had been thinking of little else. While the party continued to run its somewhat noisy course next door, Tom Churchill and I repaired to his room, where we could look at the maps and talk in peace. I explained to him the situation in the islands, and we discussed its possibilities from an operational point of view. It seemed to me that if only one commando or even a smaller detachment could be sent to Vis immediately, we could find plenty for it to do, and the mere fact of its presence would show that we meant business. Tom, who had long felt that the Dalmatian islands offered great possibilities for his type of troops, was keen on the idea, and by the time that 1944 had been seen in, it had been agreed that I should go and see General Alexander and put the idea to him personally. This I did a day or two later. I found the Commander-in-Chief and his Chief of Staff, General John Harding, much more interested in the Yugoslav situation than I had expected. They felt it had a direct bearing on the problems with which they themselves were faced in Italy. This in itself was hopeful. When I broached the subject of the commandos, they repeated what I had already heard about their shortage of men, but added that the future of the Italian campaign and of the whole war in the Mediterranean was to be discussed at a high-level conference in the immediate future, and that, once future plans had been decided, it might after all prove possible to make one or more commandos available for garrisoning Vis. The conference was to take place at Marrakesh in Morocco, where the Prime Minister was convalescing after the severe attack of pneumonia which had struck him down immediately after the Cairo conference, and General Alexander said that, if I liked, he would give me a lift there in his own airplane. The point could then be put to Mr. Churchill and a decision obtained. Randolph, who welcomed this opportunity of seeing his father, came too. The flight to Morocco in the Commander-in-Chief's airplane was a comfortable one. We landed briefly at Algiers, and then set out across the Sahara. General Alexander, I noticed, was reading a German grammar. General Harding had gone to sleep. I followed his example. When I woke, we were over what I took to be the Atlas Mountains and already starting to come down. The air over Marrakesh aerodrome seemed full of flying fortresses and liberators landing or taking off, for it was a staging point on the supply route from America to the Mediterranean. Lined up on the ground were numerous aircraft of varying degrees of magnificence, belonging to the various British and American generals, admirals, and air marshals who were attending the conference. General Wilson was among them, and Mark Chapman Walker, his military assistant, came to meet us. As we were getting into one of the immense American staff cars, which were to take us to our destination, Mark told me that General Wilson had been appointed Supreme Allied Commander, Mediterranean Theater, in succession to General Eisenhower. He added that I was to remain directly responsible to him, as I had been when he was Commander-in-Chief Middle East. I was glad to hear that this association, always a happy one as far as I was concerned, was to continue. The Prime Minister was installed in an agreeable villa in the Moorish style on the outskirts of Marrakesh. He was wearing a bright blue boiler suit, and, considering how ill he had been a week or two before, appeared remarkably well. It soon became abundantly clear that he had lost none of his old energy or resilience. I took no part in the formal meetings of the conference. Indeed, I made a special point of not being told more about the proceedings than was absolutely necessary, for in a few days' time I was due to be dropped back into an enemy-occupied country, where the possibility of being taken prisoner could never be excluded, and, with the Gestapo's methods of interrogation as good as they were known to be, it was inadvisable for anyone who ran any risk of falling into their hands to know more about the future conduct of the war than was absolutely necessary. The project under discussion was, I gathered, an aquatic hook which was to be carried out on the west coast of Italy, not far from Rome, with the object of breaking the deadlock which had set in the Italian campaign. The operation in question was to become famous not long after as the Anzio landing, but, at that time, my chief concern was to discover how it would affect the employment of Tom Churchill's Commando Brigade. On this point, I eventually succeeded in obtaining the assurance I needed. Even if the whole brigade could not be made available immediately, a token force would be sent to this at once, and other troops would follow later. Soon the conference, having made their plans for an aquatic hook, dispersed, leaving Mr. Churchill to convalesce in peace, though it was a peace that was continually interrupted by the arrival of dispatches and telegrams requiring immediate decisions. He now turned his attention once again to Yugoslav affairs. We had just heard that Jajce had fallen to the Germans and that Tito was again on the move. The partisans, Mr. Churchill felt, needed some encouragement in their time of trouble, and he accordingly sat down and wrote a personal letter to Tito, congratulating him on his past achievements and holding out the hope of future help. This he entrusted to me, with instructions to deliver it personally without delay. In order to expedite my return, he lent me his own aircraft for the first part of the journey, and Randolph and I were soon soaring above the Atlas Mountains on our way to Bari. At Bari, we found that although the enemy offensive was still in progress, the military situation was sufficiently stable for it to be possible to fix a map reference to which we could be dropped. The point chosen was near Bosanski Petrovac, in Bosnia. At this time of year, the weather over Yugoslavia was so bad that weeks might pass without there being an opportunity for a night drop, and by then the military situation might again have deteriorated. I was in a hurry to get back, and it was accordingly decided that we should go in at once by day with a fighter escort. For this purpose, we were allotted a Dakota troop carrying aircraft and an escort of 12 Thunderbolts. With me came Randolph, Sergeant Duncan, my new wireless operator, Sergeant Campbell, another signaller, Corporal Eales, and Slim Farish, who had just returned from a lightning visit to the United States. This time our drop lacked the feeling of plunging into the unknown which had lent such zest to my original venture. It was a fine morning, and we ate a large breakfast of bacon and eggs before taking off from Bari airfield. Soon we had crossed the by now familiar Adriatic and were over the Yugoslav mainland, but there were no signs of life from the anti-aircraft batteries, and no enemy fighters ventured to try conclusions with the Thunderbolts. Then came the mountains, and some cloud. By now we were not far from our destination, and it was time to adjust our parachutes. I felt for the Prime Minister's letter. It was there, securely buttoned inside my tunic. Then the doors were opened, and the dispatch assigned to us to get into position. I had decided to jump first, with the others following in a stick, and I now took my place at the open door with Randolph next to me. Looking down, I could see the houses of a village, with, near them, an open expanse of green grass. A number of figures were running about, and, as I watched, the signal fires were lit, and smoke billowed up from them. It all looked very close, and I could not help wondering whether we were high enough for our parachutes to open before we reached the ground. Then the light turned from red to green, the dispatcher touched me on the shoulder, and I fell forwards and downwards into space. That concludes the 16th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.